Welcome back. You've probably heard me talk a little about Mortimer Adler. He's one of my favorite modern philosophers, and he said that reading is a basic tool in the living of a good life. What do you think he meant by that? Well, just that simple. If you wish to have a good life, really a good life, you will use the tool of reading. The only problem with reading is that it requires discipline. Yep, you just need to make the decision to sit down and read and stay with it and look for what can change you. Change you? Yeah, change you. Change you into a good person, even a great person. That is the end of reading. Do you know what I mean when I say end? It just means the result. So becoming a great person is the result or the end of reading. Really reading to study. In this next unit, we'll read some of the very famous plays by the ancient Greeks. And there is an end to them as well as becoming great. And Aristotle teaches us what that end is. So Aristotle says, the true end of tragedy is to purify the passions. We're going to read several tragedies, and the result should be that we purify our passions, that we might become great. So get out your Google Docs or notebook and a writing utensil, whether it is your typing fingers or a pen or pencil, and let's learn a little about the background of Greek drama. We are fortunate, very fortunate, to possess several ancient plays written 2,500 years ago. That's a long time. Greek theater began in the 6th century BC in Athens with a performance of tragedy plays at religious festivals, and these in turn inspired the genre of Greek comedy plays. The two types of Greek drama, tragedy and comedy, would be hugely popular, and performances spread around the Mediterranean and influenced Hellenistic and Roman theater. Thus the works of such great playwrights as Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes formed the foundation upon which all modern theater is based. So you go and watch a movie or a play and just know that their methods and information is all based on the ancient Greek plays. And it's good to understand a little about the ancient Greek religion too. Ancient Greek was mostly polytheistic, and that means they worshipped many gods. So you've got the word poly, which means many, and theo, which means God. And so they were polytheistic. You and I are probably monotheistic because we believe in one God, and that's Heavenly Father. These gods and goddesses usually only controlled one thing, but they were good at what they did. So we know that Poseidon controlled the sea, and Athena controlled the wars and the wisdom. The Greeks created stories trying to understand nature, and those later turned into myths. Of course, Homer, as you know, wrote the most extensive narratives about the myths. 3 playwrights known as the tragedians, simply because they wrote tragedies, are named Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. So what is a tragedy? It is a dramatic play having a fatal and mournful issue. Most of the tragedies are about a person of royal blood making a terrible mistake, or through a flaw of character, falls to the depths of misery or death. Aristotle tells us in his book, Poetics, that tragedies imitate actions and reactions that instill pity and fear in the viewers, you and I, helping us to make better choices for ourselves. Aeschylus was known as the father of tragedy. He was once sent as a child to watch grapes ripen in the countryside, and when he fell asleep, Dionysus appeared to him in a dream and commanded him to write tragedies. So Aeschylus came down out of the countryside, and the next morning he began to write a tragedy, and he succeeded in that tragedy. He was just a child. As far as innovations to plays go, Aeschylus tried to incorporate more actors into his plays than did others before him, and tried to get the chorus directly involved in the storyline of the play rather than just having them exchange dialogue. He addresses intricate religious problems. And you'll see he's probably the most religious of all the playwrights. Some of Aeschylus's most famous plays include Agamemnon, where he describes how the gods punish a family for a series of murders. This year we're going to read a trilogy including Agamemnon. He also wrote The Persians, in which an Athenian victory at Salamis is celebrated. He also wrote Prometheus Bound, where the myth of Prometheus, the world's first humanitarian, is discussed. Now we come to Sophocles, and he was destined to become one of the great playwrights of his era. Since he was the son of a prosperous merchant, he would enjoy all the luxuries of a flourishing Greek empire. He studied all of the arts. By age 16, he was already known for his beauty and grace and was chosen to lead a choir of boys at a celebration. And after he completed his studies 12 years later, he was ready to compete in the city Dionysia, which was a festival held every year at the theater of Dionysus, in where new plays were presented. And in his first competition, Sophocles took first prize, actually surpassing Aeschylus himself. More than 120 plays were to follow this, and he would go to win 18 first prizes. And following that, he would never fail to take at least second. So Sophocles also did something different. He abandoned the trilogic form. That means you're telling one story using 3 separate plays to do that. Shakespeare does the trilogies as well. Aeschylus wrote the trilogies. But Sophocles abandoned this idea, and he tried to pack a story into one short, more concise form in one play. And he felt it allowed for more dramatic possibilities. And so some of Sophocles' plays include Oedipus the King, which is generally considered his greatest work, and we're going to read it this year. Oedipus unwittingly kills his father and marries his mother in an attempt to avoid a prophecy he fulfills anyway. Then there's Antigone, and she's actually Oedipus's daughter, and we'll read this one as well. But this play describes the tale of a passionate young woman who refuses to submit to earthly authority when it forbids her to a proper burial for her brother Polynices. We're going to talk a lot about government and authority here on earth and authority in God. So Antigone felt that her allegiance was to the gods above rather than to the government. When they refused to let her give her brother a proper burial. Another one is The Women of Trachis, and this offers a touching story of a jealous woman, Danae, and her husband Heracles. So now we come to Euripides, who is the son of Menasarchides, and he was destined from his birth to be a poor, misunderstood poet. He presented his first group of tragedies at Dionysia in 455 BC, but didn't win his first victory until 14 years later in 441. As a matter of fact, he won only 5 awards in his life, and the fifth one really wasn't awarded until after he died. And this lack of recognition might seem a bit odd when you consider that Euripides wrote about 92 plays and was compared to the likes of Aeschylus and Sophocles. The main reason that Euripides was ignored by the judges of the Greek festival was because he did not cater to what the Athenian crowd wanted to see or hear. He didn't approve of their superstitions and refused to accept their moral hypocrisy. So in other words, he did not believe in the gods and goddesses. He was more of a true sophic. Most of his plays dealt with many personal issues, so they had a tendency to include common, ungodlike people. Some of his famous plays include Medea, where he takes a look at the frenzied jealousy and revenge of a woman who has lost her husband's interest. And we're going to read this one. this year. Then there's another one called Hecuba, in which he documents the cruelty of Greek warriors who enslaved the Trojan queen and sacrificed her daughter at the tomb of Achilles. Now we move away from the tragedies a little and to the most famous of the comedians. Comedy in ancient Greek meant something different than our modern definition. A comedy is a story with a happy ending, usually an ending that includes in a wedding celebration or other celebration. Unfortunately, we know less about Aristophanes the man than we do about his plays, and most of what we do know about him is through references in the plays themselves. Oblique references in later plays suggest that he was probably born around 446 or 448 BCE, possibly the son of a man named Philippos from the island of Aegina, although he was almost certainly educated in Athens. That's where most all of the great men and women were educated. So he was writing at a time after the euphoria of Greece's military victories over the Persians, when the Peloponnesian War had largely curtailed Athens' ambitions as an imperial power. However, although Athens' empire had been largely dismantled by now, it had nevertheless become the intellectual center of Greece, and Aristophanes was an important figure in this change in intellectual fashions. Aristophanes was a prolific and much acclaimed comic playwright of ancient Greece, sometimes referred to as the father of comedy. 11 of his 40 plays have come down to us virtually complete, along with up to 1,000 brief fragments of other works, and are the only real examples we have of a genre of comic drama known as Old Comedy. So Aristophanes' works recreate the life of ancient Athens perhaps more convincingly than those of any other author, although his biting satire and ridicule of his contemporaries often came close to slander. We're going to read The Frogs, which puts the 3 previous tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, on trial, or maybe better said, in a competition with one another, and you're going to have to read it to find out which one of them wins. So some of his famous plays are, of course, The Frogs, which I just talked about just now, The Clouds, which is really interesting. It's a play that attacks modern education and morals, as taught by the radical intellectuals known as the Sophics. And the problem is that the main victim is Socrates, who is purposefully and unfairly treated as one of the Sophics, which he was not. Remember, he was the one that he believed in God. The Sophics didn't. Interesting. He also wrote a play called The Birds, and this is fascinating. It follows this middle-aged Athenian called Pistheterus, and he persuades the world's birds to create a new city in the sky. And so they'll gain control over all the communications between men and gods. And he himself is eventually miraculously transformed into bird-like god figure. And he replaces Zeus as the preeminent power in the cosmos. So you can see this theme of overtaking the highest god and ousting him out to reign in his place. Kind of reminds me of the Garden of Eden and Satan wanting to oust God out of the heavens and be the god of this world. Okay, the architecture was incredibly advanced and the acoustics were amazing. This structure may look familiar to you. It's called the amphitheater. At the foot of the audience, you can see there's a man right there in the center of a place that's called the orchestra. And the orchestra is a staging area. It is a circular, flat area where the actors and the musicians perform. But today, the orchestra that we know of is located in the pit, where the musicians sit hidden down underneath the stage and the actors are up on the stage. That's how the word orchestra came to us from this. Now, we've changed positions here. We are on the orchestra right now, that little raised area that you see in the center of the orchestra. It's supposedly the center of the whole orchestra. And when the choral leader stands there to chant a solo or to interact with another actor, the acoustics are such that everyone in the audience can hear. Acoustics just means that the quality of the building allows people to hear clearly and sufficiently loud. So you can imagine you standing right there in the center, that raised center right there in the front, and your friend is way up there sitting in the amphitheater. Let's say he's the guy with the blue shirt, and you're just talking like this, normal, and he can hear everything you're saying. I think as the amphitheater fills up with people, and there's just tons of people there, it probably lessens the ability to hear more, but still the acoustics are amazing. Okay, this is behind the orchestra. So imagine that you're sitting way up in the amphitheater, you're looking down, you can't see the orchestra here because the slide just doesn't show it, but you see the backdrop, and this is called the skene in Greek. And the skene just means the scene. So this is the scenery. You can see those big black doors. Those are where some of the actors come in and out. And then you've got another word that we get from the Greeks, and it's called obscene. And it might have been obscene, spelled with a K, but we don't know. We've only seen this word, obscene. And it just means off stage or behind the scenes. But you've heard this word obscene before, and you know that it has a negative meaning, and that it's something that should not be seen at all because it has an awful, immoral meaning to it, right? You've heard people say, that's obscene. I don't want to see that. I don't want to hear about it. It's obscene. Well, this word came from the Greeks, and what it originally meant was, while the people were watching actions and the storyline and anything that had to do with the violence in the play, anything that had to do with violence was done off stage so that when the people came to see the plays, they would not see anything that was violent. They would hear about the violence. They would hear about someone killing someone else or drowning someone or some other awful action, but they would never witness it. And this is why. And it's super fascinating. If you imagine that, and this is, we're not in the play right now, but if you imagine an older woman being mugged on the street and you were there watching it, your first inclination probably would be to go save that woman, right? Somehow you would get in there, you'd help that woman, you'd ward off that evil person, because that is our natural inclination, to help people, to love them and to help them. Well, on stage, when you come to watch the story, the Greeks felt like if people were to see the evil violence going on, that our natural inclination would be to run down the aisle and help them. But we know this is just a story and is just pretend, and so we train our hearts and minds to not go help. The Greeks are saying this is very immoral, to train ourselves to not be affected when somebody is killed or hurt or offended, or any of those things. And so they felt they needed to have every bit of violence, every bit of evil off stage, so that people would not have to train themselves to be okay with it in letting this violence happen right there in front of their eyes. So that's where we get this idea of obscene, that everything that we should not see should be off stage, right? Well, think about our day. How is that different than in our day? Are we seeing more and more of the actual violence on TV and movies? What about the violent video games where we not only see the violence, but we are actually moving an avatar, a visual representation of ourselves, moved by our own hands to do the violence itself? What do you think of the Greek ideal of keeping dramatic violence, the violence we see in theater and movies, off stage? Do you agree with the ancient Greeks or not? The Greeks basically would be saying to themselves, I should not see any violence and not help the victim, or it will corrupt my soul. The first Greek dramas were lengthy choral songs with only a little bit of action. You can imagine a bunch of actors standing in a row or singing in a choral area, singing the odes of what is going on. Along with them, there's a little bit of action, portrayed by one choral leader coming forward to sing a solo. And as the drama developed over the years, you would have two choral actors come forward and interact with each other, playing the parts of characters, singing one to another. But still, just a little bit of action. But the cultural difference with today is that in our plays and movies, we have a lot of action. Many actors acting and not much chorus, in fact, none, unless it is a musical, of course. Choreography is a word straight from the Greeks. Choreo means dance and graphic means writing or words and lyrics. So basically, when you had people moving from one side to another in the orchestra, the flat staging area, you would see dancing and singing. Choreography meant that there was dance and words or lyrics. The structure of the music is really interesting. So when the actors moved from stage right to stage left, they sang the strophe part of the chorus. And on the other hand, when they moved from stage left to stage right, they changed the next part of the chorus. They sang the next part of the chorus called the antistrophe. Next came the stasamon, where they stood in place and sang. And these three parts altogether were called the ode. You've heard of people singing an ode. Next, you would see a bit of action. And this was actually when the choral leader came forward to sing a solo, or when he sang with one or two other actors. And he'd probably be standing on or near that center raised area on the orchestra that we saw before. And so this part is called the episode. So this means the epi meaning action and the ode meaning song. Therefore, together they were an episode, or the action part of the song. And here's the typical structure of a tragedy. So when you look at the entire tragedy, you're going to see that it usually starts with a prologue. And that's where the tragedy's topic is presented. And you'll see a lot of this in Shakespeare as well. You'll see somebody come in and kind of talk about all that's going to happen in the play. Basically the topic of it. And then comes the parode, which is an entry chant of the chorus. So this is when we first get to know the chorus. That's the parode. And now we've got a lot of episodes, okay? And the episodes, there are typically 3 to 5 of them, where the actors interact with the chorus and they are at least partially sung or chanted. The speeches and dialogue are typically in iambic hexameter, which means there are 12 syllables on each line, and each episode is terminated by a stasamon, where the actors and chorus sing together in place. Now the episodes, remember, include all of those other things that we talked about just right before this slide. The strophe, the antistrophe, the stasamon, and the little bit of action. And that whole thing is called an episode. So then next is kind of a little moral of the story type thing that happens almost after every episode. And that's called a statismon. That's where the chorus comments and reacts to previous episodes. So this is where they're probably going to come in and maybe go, "Oh, did you see what happened? This is terrible." And they comment on what's going on, or "We're so excited that this has happened. We told them they should do this." And you'll just see a little bit of this. Some of it looks a little like gossip. A lot of it looks like judgments. It's pretty much kind of this moral judgment that you see in the statismon. And then the end of the whole tragedy is an exode, which is the exit song of the chorus after the last episode. And it looks a lot like a statismon, where they're going to be making a final commentary on the decisions that have been made by the royal highborn person. Little note on Latin, the letters EX in exode and exit. EX in Latin means out. So if you're on a freeway and you see an exit, it just means you want to go out of the freeway. Exode is We want to go out of this whole tragedy. We want to leave this tragedy and be done with it. We want to go out. So anytime you ever see the word ex, you know that it comes from the Greek and the Latin, and it means out. Here are some depictions of the mask they would wear as actors. Actors were almost always men. They would wear masks because the actors were so far away from the audience that it was difficult to see facial features. Therefore, the masks would help amplify who was who to the audience. The audience could see the masks because they were more dynamic. In addition to the masks, they wore these long robes in an array of colors like this. Here are some modern actors acting out one of the Greek plays, complete with masks and robes. And if you were to view a play today, done in the ancient manner of the Greek tragedies, this scene and the one right before would be something of what you might see. One thing to remember is that each individual in the audience knew the stories like the back of their hands. They'd been told them all their lives, and the fun thing for them was to come and see how the playwright and the director would interpret the story. Or in other words, the audience would come wondering on what point of the story would the playwright focus. So as you read the plays over the next weeks, you will now have a little background to help you understand more about Greek drama. Never hesitate to ask questions whenever you need clarification on something, and we can learn together. Thank you, and we'll see you in class.